Hi everyone, it's Jake from IHT. I'm here with Marnie and Ken Crowell, and we're at Crockett Cove Preserve. Today we're going to check out some different types of mosses that you can easily identify from the trail. I hope you enjoy.
We picked this spot in Crockett Cove Woods because there's a small loop trail that goes through some of the most beautiful moss landscape you can ever see. And my husband, the ecologist, calls this a coastal fog forest, and that is just super for the mosses. And in one way, that means there's lots and lots of mosses, and mosses tend to grow all interwoven with each other. And if you are a beginner, that can be frustrating. And so, over the years when we've given nature walks, we used to call it half a dozen species you can recognize out your car window. We don't suggest that you stay in your car. We don't even, it's just that it's fun to know that you might be right, that as far as you can see a moss, once you learn that image, you can identify it, and you probably will be right. So we've picked from our many nature walks a half a dozen that you would like. And Ken is also a birder, so he will tell you the relationship there, how we chose this.
Well, there's probably about as many kinds of mosses in Hancock County as there are birds. You may be able to remember when you got your first bird book. And if you were a beginner birder, it was pretty confusing, pretty overwhelming, with so many species of, you name it, duck, warbler. And what we've done is to pick out here species of moss that you can pretty much tell without even bending over, certainly not with a hand lens. These sort of crows and blue jays of mosses, common ones that are found, they're widespread, and you find them in about any mossy woods in Deer Isle, and easily recognized. And this is red feather moss. It's one of the more common mosses here on the forest floor. You can tell that because the midrib of each individual plant has a reddish hue. A lot of these forest floor mosses are harvested in various places to use for packing in planters. Mosses in the ecosystem are important because they hold moisture. They slow down the runoff of rain and conserve moisture for the plants in the area. Here's a little patch of moss that's quite different from the one we were looking at. You can see it has a windswept appearance, like wind blowing over a field of grass of grain. It's often called broom moss. There's a few different species in this area, but they all have this look. These little tufts that in this kind neatly leaning in one direction. Sometimes they're a bit more tousled. And this one is also fruiting. It has sporophytes that will form the spores sticking up from it. And it's the spores which disseminate the moss across the forest, and for that matter across the globe. Many of these species or related ones are found worldwide because the spores travel in the atmosphere on winds. They're so small and light.
So Ken just showed you the Dichranum, and now I'm going to show you Dichronella, which is the little version, and it's this color. And you can see that, oh, there's some things that are different colors. Well, that's what we're trying to show you, because as far away as you can see mosses, you can see the color that they are. And once you learn your common, as my husband said, crows, blue jays, robins, you get so that a flock of birds flying by, you can pick out the ones you know. Dichronella is a useful one to pick up because it doesn't mind being stepped on. So most of your park trails across the country will have some Dichronella. And if you can remember that Cinderella moss, Dichronella, you can say, oh yes, I see some Dichronella. Okay. So here is a lovely patch of Dichronella. Doesn't that look like a little elf house or something? Dichronella, the little version of Dichranum. And many of these species you'll think, you know what, they're only giving us the genus name. And that's right, most of them you probably could get the right species, but a bryologist, a person who devoted their life to this, would be using a microscope to do a lot of cellular analysis. But we don't let them have all the fun. So we're still right in eye shot of that bench where we started out. And before we head down the trail, I want to show you a moss which is not a moss, it's a liverwort. And that's a little bit different from a moss, not even the same genera, but it's a major group. And here it is. And I say it's more the color of emeralds, an emerald green color. And that's one of the ones that's very common here. And the liverwort group will be in most moss books that you can buy. And together they form a sort of time capsule because they really were practically unchanged back in the days of the dinosaurs. This is three-toothed Bassania, which means if you take a hand lens, which you can see with just your hand lens or a magnifying glass you used to read your newsprint even, that around the edges it has 3 teeth. Now you can't see it this way, but we'll show you a close-up of it. Three-toothed Bassania. And the only way that the people with microscopes and etc. tell that it's not a moss is the way the little leaflets are arranged, one on each side, whereas the mosses tend to go around. So that's a little detail, but I do have to point out that, yes, there are things that we call mosses, but they aren't really. They're very different. Three-toothed Bassania, the dinosaur pal, gets to be observed on its own.
Mosses today have on their green colors because we just had a rain. During the recent dry weeks, they've been rather subdued. And mosses do not have a season. They don't die back in winter. They're green through the winter, protecting the soil. Very little eats mosses because the mosses have compounds within them that are either distasteful or toxic. And in fact, some insecticides, future insecticides, may be derived from mosses for that reason. Nonetheless, they're very important here as forming the cover to our soils, protecting the soils through the year. Marnie made a distinction between mosses and liverworts. These plants with the pale blue-green color are lichens, and they're entirely different from mosses. In fact, they are a combination of an alga, a fungus, and quite likely a blue-green bacterium or other species working together. Lichens, perhaps even more than mosses, are pioneer species. They can grow right on bare rock, picking up nutrients from rainwater, and rather than being dependent on soil, they actually help form soil, as do mosses. So you see it here on top of a rock. You'll also find lichens, of course, on trees, but many species, but we'll go back to mosses.
So Marnie the artist thinks this is a great place to tell you, look at the different shades of green. Now you recognize this pale gray green, which is the lichen, and the lovely shades of different different mosses. Those were our ferns. Those are interrupted ferns over there. But what's interesting about this place is that we're sitting on top of granite, and in some places it makes a little basin that doesn't have much drainage. So we're looking at one of those basins right now, and we're going to come down and take a look at sphagnum and politicum, two beautiful common mosses. Most of our sphagnums are another challenge. There's 20 or more species of sphagnum we have here in Maine, but most all of them require a microscope. So Ken is only going to show you the two that you can spot standing up and far away.
Bird watchers know that you can expect to find birds. In fact, you can look for a particular species of birds by habitat. Likewise, we would look for different mosses here on this rock face. And then down here, as Marnie pointed out, we find sphagnum, peat moss. Turn that around. This tells us that there's an area here with poor drainage, that there is water. Sphagnum is what forms the bogs and also forms much of the Arctic tundra. And in fact, because it decomposes so slowly there in the Arctic, it's a great carbon sink. It's holding vast amounts of carbon, which with climate change can be released into the atmosphere. Sphagnum, again, peat moss, is what you use in your garden because of its water holding capacity. It's also been used by some native peoples for diapers. It's used for chinking cabins between the logs because it dries. This is a very common species here in our woodlands. You can identify it by its light color. It has perhaps a common name of white tip moss. But as Marnie mentioned, there are many species of sphagnum and they're very difficult to distinguish.
So a very common moss, which I think should be at the beginning of your list of learning how to spot, is called politicum or haircap. And both of those refer to the fact that if the spores were there, there would be a little cap on it with many hairs, the politicum. It's great fun when they're doing that to pick off the top of a little elf cap and see that it has a fringe on it. Kids like to do this. The reason I wanted to make sure that you saw it is because we have, again, several species of politicum, haircap moss. It's very common in dry areas. Well, here we are standing in a wet area, but it's just so lush here, so beautiful, so starry looking. So that star pattern will stick in your brain forever, so that when you see it dry on the side of a road, you'll say, oh, that's my friend Haircap. So there you go. This is what politicum usually looks like, and you find it on the sides of paths or in dry roadsides, and it's very, very common. It's just that it's not particularly common in Crockett Cove Woods, which is why when we found it up there in that granite basin that was pretty damp, as you could see, it was really happy. It grew really lush and gorgeous. So here it's a little more spaced out, but I do feel I have to show you what politicum haircap moss that wants to be part of your repertoire because it's so common.
This patch is stairstep moss. There's not very much of it in Crockett Cove Woods. You'll find it on boulders at Shore Acres and other areas, but it's a very interesting moss of these spruce forests. And if I take the liberty of picking one plant here, you'll see it has three very distinct layers. And in fact, that may mean that this one is something over 3 years old, because these, just like the whorls of branches on a fir tree, are more or less indications of a year's growth.
So here is a very nice little pincushion. It's usually shaped in a mound. It's whitish. Its scientific name is leucobryum, which is white moss, like leukocytes if you studied your blood vessel stuff. It is, when it's dry, it's whiter, and when it's a little damper, it's greener. But you see, that's still that nice little well-named, common-named pincushion, leucobryum. Sometimes it's not quite as cutely puffy as that. It's just getting started. But that's, again, one of the ways that we say that after you've taken a close-up look at these things, such as the stair step we just looked at, You know that the stair step, because of those graduated levels, looks fluffy. So when you look at one of these green panoramas and you see a piece that looks really fluffy, oh yes, when you see one that's a nice little lump, you can picture that as a little pincushion. That tells you what that is. You'd be surprised when you do a few walks, you get these in your subconscious and it compares for you automatically, and you just know them, so it's quite fun. It's like seeing an old friend at the 4th of July parade or some big group. You may not remember their name, but you know their face and you say, oh, hi, you're among friends.
Here's a patch of brocade moss. Its species name is imponens, which means imposter, which means that it seems to vary quite a bit depending on the site, which is part of nature. It's identified by this bronzy color and a fairly fine texture, hence the name brocade. Often in wetter sites, you'll find stair step down below as a skirt on a rock, and then of course our old friend red feather on the forest floor. Marnie says I make too many generalities, but that's what scientists, particularly ecologists, do, is try to perceive a pattern from what looks like chaos. Neither Marnie nor I learned anything about mosses or identifying mosses in our formal education. I learned several at summer camps in Maine, but then it had to wait until field guides came out. Remember that Roger Tory Peterson's field guide to birds was revolutionary. Well, just in the last decade or so, we have these field guides to mosses of the Northeast. This one happens to be by a former colleague of mine, and this one by Ralph Pope, Moss's Liverworts, Field Guide to Bryophytes of the Northeast, is particularly good because Pope lives in eastern Maine. So these are for you, your next step to move on to the intermediate level of moss identification. Fortuitously, 2 summers ago, Pope came here to Crockett Cove Woods and gave a moss walk. He placed these little numbered tags at some of the mosses. They're not all at the beginner's level that we just did, but here we see page number 325, which refers you to the liverwort that Marnie introduced you to. And so the numbers on the tags refer to the page numbers in this book.
I hope you all enjoyed our walk through Crockett Cove.
Thank you.
I just want to give a big thank you to Marnie and Ken for their time and offering their expertise. Please look forward to a couple more videos throughout the year, and we'll tune in with Marnie and Ken and touch base on some other fascinating topics. If you're a member of the IHT family, we thank you so much for your support. And if you're interested in becoming a new part of our family, please let us know. Thanks until next time.